Good morning, ninth grade. We're going to have a second look at the art from ancient Egypt, going more into their painting and their sculpting. Okay, looking at this slide, an Egyptian, we're calling it a painting, but what I want to point out to you straight away is actually it's a combination of sculpting and painting. You can see the wall. This is a fresco on the wall, and they have first of all carved out the image, these two people, very lightly. It's called a relief sculpture. It's very shallow relief. They have carved it out very delicately, and then afterwards come over and painted it. So in a sense, it's hard to say whether this is a painting or a sculpture. It's actually both. Looking at the image, you can see that they've done something we talked about before of showing a combination of things. The chest is actually as if it's facing us, the arms and shoulders as if they're sideways, the face is sideways as in profile, and then the eye as if we were looking straight on. So this style is a very classic, well-known Egyptian style of how to represent a human being, either from the side view or the front view, never in between. There's nothing halfway in between. It's either the side or the front. It's always from 90 degrees, side or front. And they mix that together, they combine that to create the total image. You can see when you look at this necklace here on this man, also over here on this woman, that it's absolutely symmetrical, this curve, as if he's facing towards us. And then the head and neck has turned 90 degrees to be looking to the left. And you can see the head and the hair, everything there is then from the profile. And then we go back up into the face and to the eye, and you can see that they didn't show that in profile. They turned that again back 90 degrees, so it's looking straight at us. This is something about the Egyptian style, something the formal style in which they wanted to portray themselves. I'll show you some other slides where they don't do this, which is a kind of informal, when the painting or the artwork didn't need to be formal, then it could be more flexible. But when they're doing these more formal artworks, they always follow this 90-degree rule. You can see down here, this was once a lovely blue color. This was more of a turquoise color that's faded away. The fundamental idea with Egyptian art is they wanted it to last a long time. So by carving it first, they make it more permanent, and then by coloring it, they make it more beautiful. Here is an ancient Egyptian paint box. So this is a little box carved out of wood with these nice shapes and images on it, and inside you can see there's a layer for the paints and even an upper layer to store and pigments and to mix paints, and there's even a little kind of an individual mixing palette there. So nice to see an actual real thing that an Egyptian artist would have used to paint with. It's not so different from something you could go and buy in an art store today. That's really nice to see that. That's been going on for thousands of years. Here's a panel, a painted panel. Again, pay attention to the 90 degrees. The feet are going forwards. The chest is facing us. The face is looking forward in profile. The eye is facing us. And then it becomes a little awkward here in the shoulders to go from, you can see it's a little awkward here to go from a chest that's facing us to arms that are in profile. This is a man. It must be the pharaoh. He's wearing this symbol on his forehead. And this woman must be a goddess. She has a symbol of the sun disk over her head. So this painting is about a pharaoh meeting, communicating, talking with a goddess. It's such an interesting idea of how a human being could relate to a spiritual being. It's not an image of some god or goddess far away, very remote, very inhuman, so powerful that a human being couldn't come near to them. It's a very close and intimate meeting and exchange. The goddess, although she must have some amazing powers being a goddess, has this human form and is standing on the ground and relating to this human being very directly. You can see it's so interesting the way the two hands mirror each other, they're symmetrical. And down here, how they're even holding hands. So it's such a beautiful image of a relationship between a human being and a goddess. Very friendly, very intimate, very gentle. I would like you to look at the clothing. This clothing of the pharaoh is so fine that we can even see through it. So you see the kind of folds, that side straight, that side curving. Looks like he has two layers. So he's dressed in something, some piece of cloth that is so fine that we can actually see through it. It's semi-transparent. So this must have been the most precious material that was possible to make at that time. I'd also like you to look over here at the way that this female figure is dressed with this this cloth, which has such intricate and beautiful patterns all over it. So there's something we can only imagine through these artworks, what their clothing was like, what their cloth was like, the finest things that they were able to produce. This is another image, just shows a little bit closer up. If you look at the fingers, they're all the same length. Also down here. This is another image of a human being, now a woman, with an altar in between, and quite a intricate and interesting or bizarre altar with all kinds of things. And on the other side of the altar, this god with the falcon head, so we know it's Horus, sending a message to this woman who is praying or making this kind of gesture towards that other figure. So it's so interesting, he wears the sun disk over his head, and from that come these flowers to this woman as the message from him. So the altar is in between. Here's the human world, here's the world of the gods, and across the altar he can send some answer to her of her request, of her prayer, which comes in the form of these flowers. It's so interesting to think about that. This whole image is covered with plant forms. Many interesting and intricate plant forms. But the idea that a god would send something to a person, and maybe with these flower forms, the way that it came, the way that the message came, was actually through a sense of smell. Up here we have this symbol, which is the symbol of Ra, R-A, the sun god. And beside it we have the symbols of Horus, the Eye of Horus, this is called. It's an important symbol where here we have a god Horus. This is the symbol of Horus. And scholars have done studies of this, so they've checked the mathematical proportions of all of these things. And the mathematical proportions are very interesting. They lay out in this symbol they lay out a whole number of fractions and divisions, which are part of the Egyptian understanding of the world and the way that they were able to build their temples and buildings. They had a very highly developed mathematical capability. I want to point out as well here, you see the Ankh. Now, A-N-K, is it A-N-H-K-N, I think, Ankh, you can look that up. The symbol of life. This form which has a circular top and a cross for the bottom. You see it hanging here on these cobras on two sides. You can also see that Horus is carrying that over here. He's carrying two symbols very important for the Egyptian people. This is a flail. That is something you would use to beat the grain to separate the seeds from the chaff. So it is a farming implement. And here we have a crook, the thing that a shepherd uses to shepherd his animals. So the god has these two symbols. The flail, so important in the farming with the plant world, and the crook, the shepherd's crook, so important in the farming of the animal world. And these symbols that the god is carrying here are also the symbols that the pharaoh would carry. Last thing over here, I point out as well this the Egyptian love of fine cloth. So you can see through the cloth, you can see an outline of her body and the cloth with these stripes where it's thicker or thinner or the folds are. So something we can see the Egyptians love this most fine and precious cloth. Here is a painting showing the god Anubis doing something with the mummified pharaoh, with the body. It shows a table with the legs of a lion, even the tail of a lion, and the carved head of a lion. All these patterns in the background behind. Here's another painting. It's a fresco. It's painted into plaster. This one is in the British Museum in London, so they've taken it off of the wall. It's about 2 feet square. What I want you to look, there's a few things to look at. Okay, one thing is, as we've already been seeing, how the Egyptians portray human beings with these 90-degree angles. Even in a case like this, where it's such a scene of action, the man is hunting birds in the marsh. The second thing is to notice the scale of the figures. This figure is so big, this female figure is small, and this one even smaller. Now it could well be that this is his daughter, but she would never be that small. And likewise, if this is his wife, she would never be quite that small. So I'm coming back to this thing I talked about in Mesopotamia, that the scale is not realistic. The scale represents importance. And I'd also like you to be impressed by the naturalistic painting of the animals. So the humans are quite stylized, beautiful but stylized, but the animals are very, very realistic. Look at this fish down here, this duck. I hope you can see this cat, which is also busy hunting. It's like it jumped up and caught these birds in its claws and it's biting the wing of this bird. Look at this butterfly here. The plants, these papyrus plants, are a little stylized. They're not so realistic. But the animals are very, very realistic. So this painting has so many things in it. The stylized papyrus plants, the realistic animals, the human beings done in the Egyptian style, and behind hieroglyphics, the images that they used for written language. The Egyptians never invented a script like we saw in Mesopotamia. They stayed in the realm of images. So it becomes a little bit script-like, but it never leaves the picture realm. There's always the picture. You can recognize the language doesn't, the written language doesn't progress so far as it did in Mesopotamia into abstract shapes. Here is a scene of farming, very important to the Egyptians. And what I like, as well as the beautiful scenes of plowing, sowing seeds, here's some kind of a hoe to dig the earth, and then the scene of harvesting the wheat, and then carrying the wheat to be threshed. So the animals are walking on it to get the grain to come out. I'm not sure why that man has a basket over his head. Maybe it came full and these two are going backwards with an empty basket to get more. But I'd also like you to notice, as we saw in Mesopotamia, how the picture is divided into layers, vertical layers. So if you read the story goes first you hoe the land and plow and sow the seeds. Next, the grain grows and you harvest the grain. Next, you bring it to be threshed and then to process it. So this story starts at the bottom and goes up the next layer and up the next layer. So I want you to realize that there's something happening when people divide the page in this way. For us, the Western people have decided that it's good to start at the top and go down. You start writing up here in the left-hand top corner, you go that way and that way and that way. And this story, the Egyptians don't do that. They start at the bottom and go up. Going up is going forward in time. For us, with our writing, we start at the top left and going forward is going right and then going down. So I just want you to notice that how when they started doing these kind of things, recording scenes and putting them in time, that they went in this direction. Here's a man and his wife, I guess, plowing, and she's coming behind sowing the seeds. Here are fruit trees, looks like date palms. I'm not sure what this one is. That's a date palm. That's another kind of tree. So again, the dividing down here, the trees and the river. Here, the man and his wife working. And then here, at the upper layer, the grain has grown. Another image of a man and his wife. If you remember that gesture we saw on the sculpture of the way, see her hand also goes on his shoulder and holds his arm. It seems to be this, we see this gesture many times, it seems to be the way that Egyptians like to portray themselves, that and it's so interesting that the woman, the wife, gives the man the support in this way. It's very unusual. It's not something that we see in our culture. I don't know what the flowers are. He has one in front of us. He's smelling it. She has one tied onto her head. Here's a little fragment I wanted to show you. It's so naturalistic. We can find this kind of thing over and over again. We see it in the cave paintings. We saw it in Crete. This ability of people to capture this beautiful curve of the tail and this, they capture the energy, the movement of the plants. Something very fresh and spontaneous, even when we know that there's this very formal way of painting in Egypt, there's also this very spontaneous and lifelike. They really looked closely at nature and were able to capture it. And here's another scene that shows this direction. Here's some women playing an instrument, another one beside her. Look, their feet, they're kind of kneeling, and their feet are facing the soles of their feet are facing us. We get an idea, maybe a little bit more naturalistic, of their hairstyle, their jewelry, and over here behind these two women dancing, doing some interesting kind of gestures with their hands, dancing together, doing something. And you can see here with the eyes and the face, with a scene that is not so formal, that the artist can be more naturalistic. So it suggests that the other paintings, which are very formal, there is a code, there is a practice, there is a certain style, how to represent people in a formal way. And then there's that code of how to represent them doesn't apply in other scenes where it's okay to be more naturalistic. So it's good to know that, because then we know something about the Egyptian artists and also their taste, that they can be naturalistic. They can look at real life. They can look at nature. They can paint it quite well. But when it comes to doing something more formal, then they obey certain artistic rules on how to portray the human being, especially. And that's that code I indicated. It's always from the side or from the front. It's never flexible. I like this little painting. It's some little fragment, some little sketch on a rock. It's like someone did it in their spare time. And it shows a sculptor. So here he has the mallet, and here's the chisel, and we get an idea what a funny character he was. And it has an unshaven face and what he looked like. So it's a very simple, it's almost like a piece of graffiti from that time. But it does help us to see a sculptor who did this work and his tools. So then let's move over to sculpture. We saw this one already, this stone carving of the pharaoh Zoser. Said a few things about that. So let's keep going now a bit more into the Egyptian sculpture. Here is a very famous sculpture of the pharaoh Khephren. So he is the pharaoh that made the largest pyramid we saw in Giza. So this is an image of him. The stone they choose to carve the figures in, and they're usually dark stones and very, very hard. These are like the hardest stones to carve. And the sculptors only had the most basic tools. They didn't have any modern tools that we use today. So it took a huge amount of time. And they spent so long on it to create this beautiful, smooth, and very realistic surface of the body you can feel the bones underneath there and the muscles and the realistic shaping of the head and the nose and the lips, the eyes, the ear. All these things are so difficult in such a hard stone. And then even more difficult when you have such primitive tools that they had. But one thing the Egyptians seemed to have lots of, and that was time. And they were proud to put in thousands of hours to carve these things. So let's look a little bit at the theme. Here is the pharaoh, as I said yesterday, who is the highest of the human beings. He's the top of the pyramid in the social structure. Behind him is a representation of the falcon god, Horus. So the Egyptian pharaoh is both human and God. He is the most advanced human being, and he is the kind of youngest or childlike God. And here we have a representation with the pharaoh's head and the falcon behind him of this relationship. The falcon sits behind him, on his shoulders, behind his head, giving him some kind of information or wisdom, but also through the line of the wings, the way this is carved, how the line of the wings flows down this headdress. So there's something here of this continuity of that line. The headdress here makes a kind of a division. There's the pharaoh, there's the god, the front of the pharaoh's face, the back of the pharaoh's head. This divides it, but this unites it. We saw some beautiful paintings where the human being comes towards the spiritual being, the god, facing them. But this is a very powerful image where it shows how the Egyptians felt that this knowledge and wisdom was behind them and flows from behind through them. When we see the look on the Egyptian faces, the eyes, which have this amazing look forward. I'll show you another slide in a moment. We can also see in that look in the eye that they're also kind of looking backwards. You can see how the ear as well, it's shaped to capture sound from the sides and the front, but the way it presses against this headdress is also kind of listening backwards here. This is a very beautiful and famous sculpture of Khephren. I would like you to spend a little time to draw that one. It's such a nice image. It captures something of this, the falcon behind his head. Here's a front view of a different pharaoh. And for this one, I just want you to look closely at how well carved it is. It was so important for the Egyptians to achieve this surface. See here how the surface is so smooth and round. You can see how that catches the light. They carved it and polished it and polished it and polished it. It actually starts to shine. The face, much more difficult to get into these details with the tools they had, but they managed it. And as I said to you, one of their main intentions was to make it so it would last forever. So this is a representation of the pharaoh to make up for his body, which is obviously deteriorating when he died. So this is a kind of eternal body for him that they carve in this hardest stone. For the Egyptians, this would be a disaster that some bits broke off. Here's a very beautiful, powerful sculpture. You can see how it was carved out of one block of stone. So you have to imagine this was all solid stone right up here. So that block of stone is kind of 3 feet deep and 8 feet tall. And they started at the front and they carved and carved and carved back. They've left this piece at the back, and then the figures have been carved out of this block of stone. Unbelievable amount of work to take such a huge piece of stone and to carve so much of the stone away, and then to shape these human bodies so carefully to make them so smooth, so polished. So today, I'm not sure for you what your experience is. Maybe you have granite work surfaces, countertops in your kitchen. I'm not sure what your experience of stone is, but if you do have that stone in your kitchen, you could go and look at it and just appreciate how beautiful it is when it's polished. When the stone is polished, it brings out what's living inside the stone. Of course, for us today, with our countertops and other bits of stone in our houses, this is all done by machine. But there were no machines in this time. It was all done by hand. And then to look at the theme, I'm not sure the name of this goddess with the kind of antelope horns. This goddess is Hathor, because we can see the cow form on top of her head. Sometimes the pharaohs had the headdress that I showed you before, and this is from a later period, so they have this different bell-shaped headdress which extends their head high up into the background. Again, I want you to notice the things they're all holding in their hands. And then here, this beautiful way a human being is holding the hand of a goddess. It's a remarkable idea. They are there standing a little bit behind him, kind of going with him, supporting him. He is the one who's taking a step forward. This goddess is taking a little step like him. Also, her arm is coming forward with him. And then over here, this goddess Hathor is not moving, she's standing still. If you look at all of their faces and all of their eyes, they have this far, far distant gaze, looking far, far into the future. It's very typical of all Egyptian sculptures, that they have this long distance view into the far, far future. When we put that idea together with the idea that most of their sculptures are made for the afterlife, then there's something about this looking into the far future that goes together with their idea of what it was like to be in the afterlife. A more everyday sculpture, let's say, of a woman. The proportions are not quite realistic. She has a narrow body and a large head. But this gives you maybe a more of a sense of what the person really looked like. The sculptures of pharaohs could be idealized, and this one may be more realistic. You can see that it was a light stone, a softer stone, and was then painted. You can see the skin tone and the eyebrow and the eye makeup around the eye here. This is a very famous sculpture of the queen Nefertiti, who was the wife of Tutankhamun. I think I got that right. And you can see how realistic this one is. As the sculptures get more realistic, we can see more into their facial structure. We can see more into their personality. They may well have emphasized her neck a little bit. The beautiful line here. So it's made from a light stone, a kind of a limestone, and then very carefully painted to be very realistic. This is the front view. Straight away you can notice that one eye is missing. The other one is made to be very realistic. So we can assume that this is quite lifelike, quite realistic. And then, of course, there's many speculations about what the ancient Egyptian people really looked like. And here you can see quite a fine features. And then this is the mask of Tutankhamun. This was one of the great treasures that was discovered not so long ago. Howard Carter digging in the Valley of the Kings and finding this undisturbed burial chamber of the boy king, as he's called, Tutankhamun. He didn't live very long. He died quite young. And there we can see something, this spectacular shaping of gold and lapis lazuli to give this incredible lifelike impression of this young man. This one, maybe more than any other artwork from Egypt, helps us into the incredible richness of that culture, their love of beauty and of precious metals and precious stones. So this is a mask. It was placed over his mummy in his tomb, with the idea that this was how he looked, and this was how he should continue to look through eternity. If you just for a moment look at the sides, you'll see the headdress with these stripes. It reminds you of the Sphinx, and also, of course, of the line of the pyramid. So when we see that, that's a kind of Egyptian motif, this pyramid motif. You can even see here, this makes a triangle, a pointed pyramid on each side, and then together a larger pyramid. This is the goddess Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess. I'm not going to show you too many more sculptures, but there are so many of the Egyptian gods and goddesses. They have a human body and they have an animal head. You saw a few yesterday with the different, the Anubis and Thoth and the Set, and the different gods that have part human, part animal features. This is a beautiful picture. I love this, the way the light is falling onto this figure. She has the cobra here, the disc up above. Very powerful, with the hand flat or the hand holding something. Just the whole gesture. And the way this one is lit up helps us to understand or have a feeling for the Egyptian art, that it was meant to be placed in tombs and in the dark. And it has a certain power, a certain mood and a certain power because of that. The sculptors were making, the artists were making things that were to go into the world of darkness, into the afterlife. So they knew that when they were carving them or painting them, that they weren't really supposed to see the light of day. They were supposed to have a power and a presence in this other world. And this slide really helps with that, to have that feeling of this dark, powerful presence that they were always trying to evoke with their artworks. I'd like to show you this man, the sculpture of this man, just to have an idea about the spatial characters of Egyptian sculpture, so how they are in space. So you can see from the front view, this is a block. Don't worry about that. That's made by the museum because it was broken. So of course the legs should go all the way down to the bottom. You can see how carefully and beautifully they have sculpted the body. So they really have a feeling. Look at these knees. They really have a feeling for the human body. The torso, the arms, and even the face. Very, very realistic and very kind of soft and sensitive. So the front view looks quite normal, naturalistic. If I show you the side view, this is the same sculpture. I'd like you to see how straight it is on the back, and how when we see it from this view, we can see that even though that leg is going forward, most of his weight would be on the back foot. It's interesting, there's quite a contrast if you go from this back to this one. Same sculpture. This one looks like he's really going forward, but when you see the side view, you can see actually he's not, he's standing. And then when we take a look at the back view, you can see that part of the sculpture has this pillar in the back, and this pillar would go into a slot in the wall of the building. So this sculpture would be placed up against the wall of the building. So here, this piece here goes into a groove in the building, a slot, and then his back is really touching the back of the building. So almost all Egyptian sculptures have this idea that they should be placed with their backs against the wall. The Egyptians don't really have the idea about freestanding sculptures. This comes later. This is something the Greeks invented. So the Egyptian sculptures are always connected to a building. They're always attached to a building. Here's a closer-up of his face. You can see the stone and the coloring of the stone. You can see where it's worn away. Probably here he had some gold, a gold necklace, but it's disappeared. This is a very famous sculpture of the scribe. So we've seen in our other art history lessons the development of writing, but we've never seen an image of the person who was doing the writing. We don't know what they looked like or how they were thought of in those cultures, but here in Egypt we have a few sculptures where the scribe is portrayed. And it's so interesting to see this, that how a person would write in those times. And I'd like you to notice how he's sitting, his crossed legs. If in another culture this would look a little bit like a Buddha figure, with the crossed legs and kind of looking up into the sky and being very peaceful. But in Egypt, that is the image of how to write, how to do the hieroglyphics. So he's sitting there very relaxed. He has his papyrus in his lap. He has his hand holding the pen, and then his face is looking up. And maybe the expression is more of listening. He's certainly not hunched over or struggling with his letters. It's a very different image than we might imagine of what it took to be a scribe, to be someone who did the writing in those ancient times. Now this is probably a sculpture again for this man who was a scribe as he goes into the afterlife. So we can say it's a kind of idealized or an eternal picture of what it means to be a scribe. Here's another one. So there are many images of scribes, not quite so upright as the other one, and not looking up into the sky, more looking forward. But the same kind of idea, the same gesture of sitting with crossed legs, not struggling and straining to write the hieroglyphs, but rather having this distant gaze and listening, trying to find the right images, the right pictures to make the right words. So 9th grade, please do the same practice. Listen to the slideshow, take notes, make small sketches. Please don't get overwhelmed if you feel there's just too many images. And if we were in a classroom, I would have a better sense of speeding up or slowing down. So I just have to give you these, share these images with you. So that's up to you to, do as much as you feel is right. You would have listened to the slideshow and heard that information, so you've heard it, and what we're doing distance learning is different from being in the classroom. So, but what I've seen so far, you've been sending me beautiful main lesson pages. So if you can keep doing that, that's wonderful. Today, with these Egyptian images, I would like you to, yes, do some notes and some small sketches, but then please choose one. there are some really spectacular artworks in today's slides. So I would ask you to choose one that you like, and I would ask you to choose one of either Khephren, that's the pharaoh with the pharaoh on his shoulders behind him, or Nefertiti, the beautiful queen of Tutankhamun, or the gold mask of Tutankhamun, and spend a little bit more time, do a nice drawing. You could fill up of your main lesson books. They could take a whole page, and just don't stress out about it, but enjoy actually living into those very powerful, beautiful images that have come to us from thousands of years ago. Okay, thank you.